The federal government spent decades, and a string of American zoos spent real money, breeding and protecting an insect about 1.5 inches long. A beetle. Not just any beetle. A carrion beetle, the kind that finds a dead bird or a dead mouse, drags it underground, and feeds it to its children. The kind of thing most people would step on without slowing down. And yet, biologists raised it in trays, flew its offspring to islands, and counted every single one. So, I have to ask the obvious thing. Why would anyone spend that kind of effort, on that kind of money, to save a bug? Because the answer is stranger and more uncomfortable than you would guess, and it ends in a courtroom. So what exactly is this insect, and how did a beetle end up with a federal rescue mission built around it? Its name is the American burying beetle, and it is the largest carrion beetle in North America. Picture something over 1.5 inches long, a glossy black body, and across its wing covers, 2 bright bands the color of orange peel. Even the tips of its antennae are orange, little clubs it uses to smell death on the wind from a long way off. For a beetle, it is genuinely striking, and 200 years ago, you could have found it almost anywhere east of the Rockies. It lived across roughly 35 states. It crossed into Canada. It was common, ordinary, everywhere. And then it started disappearing, quietly, the way insects do, without anyone really noticing, until it was nearly too late. By the time scientists went looking, the collapse was almost total. The American burying beetle had vanished from about 90% of the land it once owned. The maps that used to be covered coast to coast east of the plains had shrunk down to almost nothing. There was one population clinging to Block Island, off the coast of Rhode Island, and there was one county in eastern Oklahoma. That was essentially it. A creature that had blanketed half a continent was down to an island and a patch of prairie. In 1989, the federal government listed it as endangered. And here is the part that surprised me. It became one of the very first insects ever protected under the Endangered Species Act. A law most people picture protecting eagles and wolves and whales was now legally bound to save a beetle that eats dead things. But what killed it? Because that question turns out to matter more than anything. There was no oil spill, no single hunter, no poison that explains it cleanly. The villain here is quieter and, in a way, more disturbing. It comes down to food. Remember, this is the biggest carrion beetle on the continent, and being big has a cost. To breed, this beetle does not want just any scrap. It needs a whole carcass of the right size, somewhere around the weight of a dove, a quail, or a small rodent. Not too small, not too big. And as eastern North America was carved into farms, broken into fragments, and lit up at night, the supply of those medium-sized dead animals started to dry up. One of the leading ideas ties the timing to something we did long ago. The passenger pigeon, a bird that once darkened the sky in flocks of millions, was hunted into extinction by the early 1900s. Quail thinned out. Other mid-sized birds and mammals declined. And the beetle that depended on their bodies declined right alongside them. To make it worse, the animals that boom around human land, the raccoons, the skunks, the crows, got to the carcasses first and stole them. So the beetle was starved out, slowly, by a world that had quietly stopped producing the dead at the size it needed. It is a grim story for a grim little animal. But here is where it turns, and where I started to understand why anyone cared. Watch what this beetle actually does, and it stops being repulsive. A male and a female find a small carcass, sometimes from far away, drawn by those orange antennae. They will fight off rivals to claim it. Then, together, they bury it. They strip away the fur or the feathers. They work the body into a tight ball. And then they coat it in secretions that slow the rot, a kind of natural preservative that holds back the bacteria and the maggots that would otherwise win. They are embalming it. The female lays her eggs nearby, and when the larvae hatch, both parents stay. They open a small hole in the buried ball, and they feed their young, mouth to mouth, regurgitating the carrion so the babies can eat. The larvae are so dependent that many would simply die without a parent feeding them. This is biparental care, a mother and a father raising young together, and it is almost unheard of in the insect world. The thing most people would crush with a shoe is one of the most devoted parents in nature, raising its family inside a grave it dug and preserved with its own body. That is what the scientists saw. Not a pest. A small, doomed marvel. And they decided it was worth fighting for. So they built a machine to bring it back. It started at the Roger Williams Park Zoo in Providence, Rhode Island. Beginning in the early 90s, and standing alone as the lead facility from 1994, The zoo founded an entire captive colony on a tiny handful of insects taken from Block Island, just 19 males and 11 females. From those 30 beetles, over the years, they reared more than 5,000. The work has been led for decades by a conservation director named Lou Perotti, a man so devoted to this insect that he reportedly wears its image as a tattoo. His own words about why it matters cut deep. The beetle, he has said, was in his ecosystem within his lifetime, and then it was gone. From that colony, the zoo released more than 3,000 beetles onto Nantucket, off the coast of Massachusetts, trying to plant a new wild population in the sand and the scrub. And it did not stop there. The St. Louis Zoo bred thousands more, and in 2012, working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Missouri Department of Conservation, and the Nature Conservancy, released zoo-raised beetles into southwest Missouri for the first time. In Ohio, a conservation center called the Wilds partnered with the Cincinnati Zoo, produced hundreds of beetles in a single year, and released them back onto the grasslands. But this was not a clean victory, and the people doing it would tell you so. A reintroduction on Penakees Island, also off Massachusetts, was judged a failure. On Nantucket, researchers found there was not even enough natural carrion left to feed the beetles they had established, so the carcasses sometimes had to be handed to them. Think about what that means. We were not just breeding the insect. In places, we were feeding it by hand, because the wild could no longer do it. And still, the numbers were real, and the work went on for decades. Which brings us to the moment the government decided it had won. In 2020, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service downlisted the American burying beetle from endangered to threatened, a step back from the edge. Officials framed it as a partnership-driven recovery, proof that the long, strange effort had paid off. On paper, the beetle that had nearly vanished was now merely in trouble instead of dying. But who actually asked for that downgrade? Because once you follow that thread, the clean success story starts to come apart. The push to weaken the beetle's protection did not come from biologists celebrating a comeback. Back in 2015, it came from the Independent Petroleum Association of America, the oil and gas lobby, which petitioned to cut the beetle's protections, openly citing the hurdles the insect created for drilling in Oklahoma. The beetle's surviving range sits right on top of oil country, and when the downlisting came, it arrived with a special rule attached, one that allows oil and gas development inside the beetle's habitat in Oklahoma. Here is the detail that stops me cold. The beetle never actually met the recovery targets the government itself had set back in 1991. It had not hit the population goals. The service downlisted it anyway, arguing the old targets were the wrong measure. Conservationists were furious. The Center for Biological Diversity called it an undeserved gift to the oil and gas industry, and argued the beetle was not recovering at all, but spiraling toward extinction as its habitat was sold off to drilling. They pointed out that the law defines an endangered species as one at risk across a significant portion of its range, and with 90% of the range already gone, they said, the beetle still qualified. So they sued, and they lost. In 2023, a federal district court upheld the downlisting, even while admitting that climate change poses a grave, foreseeable risk to the beetle's remaining populations in the decades ahead. A federal appeals court later agreed, reasoning that while the beetle faces real danger 20 years out, it is not at immediate risk of extinction today. The threatened status stood. So here is the honest question, and I genuinely cannot answer it for you. If a creature only survives because we breed it in trays and sometimes hand it its food, and the government calls that a recovery in the very same era, it opens that creature's home to drilling. Did we save the beetle, or did we just save the paperwork? One side says any living wild population is a victory worth every dollar and every decade. The other side says a species kept alive on life support in a home that keeps shrinking was quietly downgraded for the convenience of an industry. Which one is closer to the truth? Pull back far enough, and the beetle stops being the point. What this little orange-banded insect really exposes is how we decide which lives are worth saving at all. We will pour decades into something beautiful and famous without blinking. But an inch-and-a-half undertaker that buries the dead and feeds its babies in the dark, we had to be argued into it. And even now we cannot agree on whether we succeeded. The beetle is still out there, on Block Island in the Oklahoma prairie, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of burying the dead. The same work it has done for far longer than we have been deciding its fate. So I will leave it with you. Was the American burying beetle truly saved, or just reclassified? Tell me what you think down in the comments, because honestly, this one is too close to call alone.